Welcome to week 3, Cultures and Societies of Arab-Speaking Countries. For this week, we will be covering the Ottoman Empire's fall and the creation of the modern Arab nations. So there are many factors that led to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. One of them was its struggle to follow up with the industrialization that happened in Europe. So they were quite behind, also referred to as the old sick man of Europe. So by the end of the 20th century, up until the entrance of the 21st century, the Ottoman Empire disintegrated slowly. In the PDF text that you should be reading, we will be covering a few factors, and some of them are, for instance, the European interference in the Middle East, and the Ottomans also were not very popular in many countries that had taken over, so a lot of the tribes that were in, for instance, the Arabian Peninsula were quite reluctant to stay on under its wing. So when the English proposed independence and individual states, many of the Arab countries were willing to give up the Ottomans for a more independent Arab future. So a lot of factors happen, or a lot of events did happen, almost like a domino effect after the fall of the Ottomans, which I am describing more in detail in the PDF. And also there is a map that shows how the Ottomans slowly disintegrated. So you've got the Ottoman Turks that were introduced into the Middle East in the 1300s, and then eventually by the 1800s slowly losing ground. I do not go in much details exactly year by year how the empire fell. However, I am showing you how from the fall or the taking over of Cyprus, for instance, by the English, you also have internal struggles in Turkey with a new generation that demanded more modernization of the state, which eventually led to the young Turks taking over, with being one of its leaders, Ataturk. Eventually, actually Ataturk was the first president, and that eventually led to the involvement of European states in the Middle East, and the independence of many of its countries. That also led to the oil, or the use of oil in the region by also Western powers. So Western oil companies established a dominance over the oil production and extraction of the area. So like I said, it was almost like a domino effect that eventually led to what is now the modern Middle East, and on to part 2. Part 2, now I go into more details on how the empire disintegrated. So we've got here first a mention of the 3 pashas, which were almost like 3 military leaders in Turkey that were back then in around 1914, so World War I. A superpower, or the Ottomans were against some of the superpowers in Europe. The alliance also that Turkey made with Germany proved fatal, and that was at the Austria-Hungary World War against Britain and France, and that's when the British and the French saw the Ottoman Empire as a weak link of Europe. Thereafter, the British sought alliance with Sharif Hussein, which were the hereditary ruler of Mecca, and then an Arab revolt was created against the Ottoman rule after being promised independence. So the Allies, led by Britain, so the Allies were European states that had as a mission to make the Middle East independent, but also under their influence. So the war that the British then inspired to the ruler of Mecca, it did transform today's Middle East and increased British and French involvement. So when the Ottoman Empire was defeated by Arab uprising, that is also when the British took over Palestine, and in 1918, and a new deal was made with the British, and the British and French governments concluded a secret treaty called the SCHG Agreement, and that led to the partition of the Middle East between them. In the PDF, I have included a map that shows you precisely which areas belonged to which European country, and also you could see the almost straight lines that were made and carved up by the Allies. So the Sykes-Picot Treaty not only carved up the Middle East, but it also divided some of the ethnicities that lived there for hundreds of years. So we could say that today's conflicts in the Middle East could have been instigated by this treaty and by the division of these states. So there is also, as I said, a map that shows the different European countries' monopoly of a certain area. So you could notice that the North Africa was predominantly managed by France, while other areas were managed by the British. So when World War I ended, the rest of the defeated Ottoman Empire was also carved up by the Europeans, and also creating today's Turkey. So that is part 1. On to part 3. So part 3, Ottoman defeat and partition. So in short, when the Ottomans departed, the Arabs proclaimed an independent state in Damascus, but were too weak military and economically to resist the European powers. So the British and the French, as I mentioned before, were much involved in the process of what became the Middle East today. So, for instance, Syria became a French protectorate. The Christian coastal areas were split off to become Lebanon, another French protectorate. Iraq and Palestine became British mandated areas. Also, a new country was created more or less in Jordan, and also Faisal was installed as the king of Iraq, and Iraq incorporated large populations of Kurds, Assyrians, and Turkmens, whom have been promised independence as well. So that is one of the reasons today's Iraq has many minorities in it. and Britain was granted a mandate for Palestine in the 1920s, and in 1922 this mandate was approved by the League of Nations. So it was a treaty that was accepted by many nations. So Palestine not only became the British mandate, it was also placed under direct British administration. At that time, the Jewish population of Europe and other areas were given free rein to immigrate and buy land from absentee landlords, etc. The territory east of the Jordan River, as mentioned earlier, was so they created then the Jordan, which was also a British memorandum, and most of the Arabian Peninsula fell to other British allies. Ibn Saud as well, which were a tribe that were much respected in the Arabian Peninsula, took over the area and made it into what is today called the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. That was in 1932. So during that era, so from the 1920s onwards, a lot of Arab countries gained more or what somehow independence. Not full, of course, because there was always British or French involvement, but they did move towards independence. You have, for instance, 1919, Egypt's Saad Zaghloul, which orchestrated a mass demonstration in Egypt, which created then the first revolution in Egypt. He became the prime minister. However, that led also to some political conflicts. You also have Syria, they also gain independence, and other kingdoms in the area. There is a bit more about the Egyptians' position during the World War I and II, and also a mention of the rise of the power of Hitler in Europe and the Nazi influence, which led to many Jews being persecuted, and then also led to mass migrations to Palestine, which eventually the Jewish state were created by the population there. So a Palestinian state was also a option back then, and many Arab countries did agree with the deal, the British as well. So there was a partition between the Israeli and the Palestinian areas. So on to number 4. Part 4. New states after World War II. So the British, French and Soviets, they departed from many areas of the Middle East, and which affected also the area. So Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia and the states in the Arabian Peninsula generally kept their boundaries. After the war, however, 7 Middle East states gained or regained their independence. So you've got 1943 Lebanon, 1944 Syria, 1946 Jordan, which is was a British mandate before that, and then it ended with its independence. 1947 Iraq, 1947 Egypt as well, 1948 Israel, and 1960 because it was under Ottoman Empire rule, we could mention as well Cyprus. So following adoption of the Alexandria Protocol in 1944, a new league was created after the World War II, and that was the Arab League that still exists today. So it's almost like the United Nations, so it is a joint force of many Arab countries, and they deal with everything from conflict resolution to other issues. So that was created in 1944, and also it was or it served, it still does, as a regional organization of Arab states. There are also many countries, there were a few countries in the beginning, but many others joined eventually. So the first major action from the Arab League was the joint intervention on behalf of the majority of Arab population that was wanted to deal with the Israeli issue in the Middle East that emerged, so the Israeli state that emerged in 1948. And but a major participant in this intervention then was Transjordan, had agrees with the Israelis to divide up the Arab-Palestinian state proposed by the United Nations General Assembly. So the Arab League were quite weak when it dealt with the new state that were at their midst. And eventually a common market was also created in 1965. So the struggle between the Arabs and the Jews in Palestine did start more or less in the 40s. So the treaty eventually became that it wanted to create a Jewish state, but there was also a unanimous agreement that an Arab state should also exist alongside it. So when the British mandate then expired, the Zionist leadership declared the State of Israel as mentioned, but then the armies of Egypt, Syria, Transjordan, Lebanon, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia intervened, but were defeated. So about 800,000 Palestinians fled from areas, and many live today in other parts of the Middle East, such as there's a large population in Jordan, for instance. Approximately 2/3 of the Jews that were expelled or who fled many areas of the world did end up in Israel and were naturalized by the state. So that's the end of part 4. 5 modern Arab states. So we know that the states were more or less carved up by British and French and European rules, and the modern Middle East was actually shaped by 3 things, or 3 factors. So the departure of European powers and their entrance, of course, firstly and foremostly, and then eventually their departure, the founding of Israel, and the growing importance of the oil industry. So these developments eventually led to the US involvement in the region. So the United States were the ultimate guarantor of the region's stability as well as the dominant force in the oil industry after the 1950s. And when revolution brought radical anti-Western regimes to power, for instance in Egypt 1954, Syria 1963, and Iraq 1968, as well as Libya in the end of 1960s, the Soviet Union, seeking to open a new arena of the Cold War, allied itself with Arab socialist rulers like Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. However, these powers eventually crumbled. So these regimes gained popular support with the promises to destroy the State of Israel and all the other Western imperialists. However, the Six-Day War of 1967 ended with an overwhelming Israeli victory, as well as a failure by these sentiments or organizations. So the United States essentially started as an oil investor in the 1950s and then got involved in the politics as well, and felt obliged to defend its remaining ally, which were the monarchies of Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Iran, and the Persian Gulf Emirates. And perhaps that is one of the reasons today they are quite rich and powerful nations with large oil reserves. And in the mid to late 1960s, the Arab Socialite Ba'ath Party, led by Michel Aflaq and Salahuddin al-Bidar, took power in both Iraq and Syria. So the Ba'ath Party eventually became the ruling of these areas, and also leading to Saddam Hussein's power over Iraq. and simultaneously in Egypt there was a power struggle with the socialites, with the traditionalist and the more modernist political parties. There is also a mention in the text about the United Nations Assembly in 1975 that was actually condemning the Zionist force against Palestinians, and at that time the president in Palestine was Arafat. So due to many frantic events in the 1970s in the Middle East, it also culminated into the Iran and Iraq war that happened in the 1990s, also related to the US involvement in the area, the oil reserves, and also the division of the states. So on to number 6 now. So part 6, 1990s until the present time in the Middle East. So we did mention the Kuwaiti issue, or the Iraq and Iran war first and foremostly, and also the Kuwaiti conflict that happened as well in the 1990s, which was also related to the intervention of US powers, and the Gulf War was led by the US military presence, which also gained a more permanent presence in the Persian Gulf after that time, particularly in Saudi Arabia, and which offended many Muslims in the area, which culminated into what happened during September 11th, which because the perpetrators were many of them were Saudi nationals. So one thing leads to the other in the Middle East, and for instance, when there was a change of governance in many other parts of the world, it did not occur in the Middle East. So the whole region, only Israel, Turkey, and to some extent Lebanon and the Palestinian territories are considered by the Western powers as democracies. Some countries have legislative bodies, but they have little power, and in the Gulf or Persian Gulf states, the majority of the population could not vote because they were guest workers. So this was from the 1990s onwards. So in most Middle Eastern countries, the growth of market economies is said to be or was limited in many areas, and there was much restrictions, corruption, and overspending on arms and other issues in the area that has led to some economic stalling. It could also be said about the embargoes that happened in Iraq and Syria, and that halts as well an economy in many countries. So these successful economies were all the countries that are quite rich today, such as Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates, which have been doing quite good since the 1990s. And also Lebanon, it's worthy to mention, also rebuilt itself quite successfully after the civil war in the 1980s. So all these factors are what have contributed to what is today the Middle East. I haven't mentioned much of North Africa, but that is also the case in North Africa. And in the PDF, I do mention a lot of the US interventions that happened after that, and how that has led also to migrations to Europe. And that is why part 7 would deal with Arabs in Europe. There is also a map that shows the aftermath of the Arab Spring, which happened in the mid-2011, and that was when many of the populations of these areas were quite unhappy with how the government was dealing with social issues and economic issues in these areas, and so mass demonstrations were made, and which led eventually to what is called the Arab Spring. However, this also created other conflicts, such as the ongoing conflict in Syria, and also the collapse of many of the new governments that came after, such as in Egypt, and in some countries not much change except for Tunisia, that did have a democratically elected new president after the Arab Spring. So on to part 7 now. Conclusion. Part 7 is Arabs in Europe, and since the conflicts in the Middle East and North Africa, and also economic collapse, has had an effect on how migration has developed the last few decades, and many of these migrants that come to Europe are from Arab countries. There are many other reasons. There is a large Arab population in many countries in Europe, and one of them could be the labor export agreement that was made between several European countries to bring on labor into Europe. That was made from the 1950s onwards. The civil wars that happened in Iraq, Syria, etc. created a large influx of migrants into Europe, which also has created something that we called Islamophobia, because the Arabs that have come to Europe are predominantly Muslims, although many of them are not. But however, being Arab and Muslim is it's quite a connected issue, and that has created what is today some grievances from Europeans. So a large majority of these migrants originate from Arab country, and the migration issue is a present-day issue in the European political agenda. And attitudes towards Muslims in various Western countries have led to the emergence of the term Islamophobia. I have also in the last part of the PDF mentioned how that has had an effect on the Arab populations in Europe, and also how Arabs in Europe have also contributed positively to the societies here. There is also a map that shows the different dialects that Arab countries have, and that has also led to a new emergence of identity here in Europe. For instance, a large section of Arabs from many areas have now access to each other, which has created a middle languages or new dialects that have emerged from communicating with other Arabs from other parts of the world. That has also created the kind of new communities here in Europe. And also there is a mention of the influx of migrants, especially Muslim migrants, and that is taken from the Pew Research Center. So there are many factors, for instance, that France and Germany have the largest Muslim populations in Europe. The Muslim share of Europe's total population has been increasing steadily. Muslims are much young and have more children than other Europeans, which will affect the demographics here in this region. And between mid-2010 and mid-2016, migration was the biggest factor driving the growth of Muslim populations in Europe. So an estimated 2.5 million Muslims came to Europe for reasons other than seeking asylum. And views of Muslims vary across European countries, and this Pew Research Center have conducted many surveys and have seen that there are different visions or experiences of what an Arab and Muslim constitutes. And lastly, there is also a map that shows us the Muslims around the world, which shows actually interestingly that most Muslims reside in South Asia and not in the Middle East. So being Arab does not necessarily mean that you're Muslim, and being Muslim does not necessarily mean that you're Arab. So as a conclusion to to week 3, it is interesting to see how North Africa and the Middle East was carved through conflicts, through treaties, and through interest in the region, and the conflicts that we have today and the issues that are in these or exist in these countries are a result of historical factors. So for instance, in North Africa, we have the second language being French that are still taught in schools because these were French protectorates. So this is the end of week 3, and looking forward to see you soon for week 4. Thank you.